The celebration lasted long after the moon climbed high above the capital. Victory banners fluttered from every tower. Bonfires burned in the palace courtyard. Music echoed through the marble halls as nobles, generals, and warriors celebrated King Kalan Draven's triumph over the Northern Coalition. Everywhere, goblets were raised. Laughter filled the air. Only one person was missing from the festivities. Queen Elena Ravenshade walked quietly through the palace, carrying a silver tray. Upon it rested a steaming cup of herbal medicine. For 3 years, she had prepared it herself every evening. The royal physicians insisted the king's old battle wounds healed more comfortably if he drank it before sleeping. Kalan always thanked her with a polite smile. Never more, never less. Even so, Elena treasured those small moments. They reminded her that caring for someone did not always require grand declarations. Sometimes, love lived in ordinary acts no one else noticed. She reached the banquet hall just as another round of laughter erupted inside. The great doors stood slightly open. Elena paused, smiling to herself. Perhaps she would wait until the conversation ended before interrupting. Inside, one of Kalan's oldest generals lifted his glass. "To our victorious king." The room answered with a cheer. Another alpha laughed. "Tell us, your majesty, after 3 years of marriage, has your Luna finally stolen your heart?" More laughter followed. Several officers leaned forward, eager for the king's answer. Elena felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She had never asked Kalan whether he loved her. She had always believed love arrived quietly, growing little by little. Perhaps tonight, she would finally hear the words she had waited 3 years to receive. Kalan smiled faintly. Then his expression settled into calm seriousness. "My heart belongs to this kingdom." The room grew quieter. "I married Elena because peace required it." One younger commander grinned. "So you'll never love her?" Kalan didn't hesitate. "I swore on my father's grave that I would never allow love to rule me. I will honor her. I will protect her. But I'll never love my Luna." Time seemed to stop. Outside the doorway, Elena's fingers lost their strength. The silver tray slipped from her hands. It struck the marble floor. Glass shattered. Herbal medicine spread across the white stone like spilled tears. For one desperate heartbeat, she waited. Surely someone had heard. Surely Kalan would come to see what happened. But another burst of laughter rose inside the hall. The music continued. No footsteps followed. No one noticed the queen standing alone beyond the doorway. Elena slowly knelt. With trembling hands, she gathered the broken pieces of glass. A servant hurried over. "Your Majesty, let me." "It's all right," Elena whispered. "I've got it." She wasn't talking about the broken cup. She was trying to convince herself. When the last shard rested in her palm, she stood. Her eyes lingered on the banquet hall one final time. Kalan looked exactly as he always did. Calm, composed, honorable. He wasn't a cruel husband. That realization hurt the most. He had never lied to her. He had simply never given her what she had silently hoped would one day bloom between them. She returned to their chambers alone. That night, she sat beside the window until dawn painted the sky with pale light. For the first time since becoming queen, Elena cried, not because her husband hated her, but because she finally understood the truth. She had spent 3 years loving a man who had already decided he never would love her back. The palace was still asleep when Elena made her decision. She did not make it in anger. She made it in silence. The tears she had shed during the night had left her strangely calm. If Kalan had promised never to love her, then she would no longer ask him to carry a marriage he had never truly wanted. As the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, Elena opened the carved cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside rested the symbols of a life she was about to leave behind. She lifted the moon crown first. Its silver gems caught the faint morning light. 3 years earlier, she had believed wearing it meant she had found both a kingdom and a home. Now it felt heavier than ever. She placed it carefully on the dressing table. Next came the royal jewels, the sapphire necklace gifted by the council, the bracelets worn during state ceremonies, the emerald earrings Kaelin had once chosen because he thought they suited her eyes. She smiled sadly. He had always been thoughtful, always respectful. He had simply never been in love. One by one, she returned everything to its velvet cases. Finally, she looked at the simple gold wedding ring resting on her finger. Her hand trembled. Slowly, she slipped it off. For several moments, she simply held it in her palm. Then she laid it gently beside the crown. The room suddenly felt unfamiliar, as though it had never truly belonged to her. Elena changed into an ordinary gray traveling dress. No royal embroidery, no jewels, no crest of the Moon Kingdom. Only a small satchel rested over her shoulder. Inside were spare clothes, a few healing herbs, and the worn leather journal her mother had given her as a child. Nothing else. She sat at the writing desk and unfolded a sheet of parchment. The words came more easily than she expected. "You promised me protection. You never promised me love. I deserve a life where I am chosen willingly. Please don't search for me." She signed only her name, Elena. Not Queen Elena, just Elena. Before leaving, she looked around the chamber one last time. There were no bitter memories here, only quiet hopes that had never come true. She placed the letter where Kaelin would find it. Then she slipped through a narrow servant's passage hidden behind the palace library. Years earlier, she had discovered it while delivering food to injured servants during a winter illness. Few people even remembered it existed. The passage led beyond the palace walls. No guards questioned the woman dressed as a common traveler. The queen disappeared into the waking city before sunrise. By the time the palace servants entered the royal chambers, the bed was empty. The crown remained. The jewels remained. The wedding ring rested beside the farewell letter. Captain Rowan immediately informed the king. Kaelin looked up from the reports on his desk. "She probably wanted time alone," he said quietly. "Let her have the morning." Only after breakfast did he return to their chambers. He expected to find Elena reading by the window. Instead, he found silence. His eyes settled on the ring, then the letter. He unfolded it slowly. With every line he read, the confidence in his expression faded. When he reached the final words, his hand tightened around the parchment. For the first time since the battlefields of his youth, King Kaelin Draven felt something that no enemy had ever managed to awaken: fear. The first search lasted 3 days. The second lasted 2 weeks. By the end of the first month, riders had crossed every road leading from the capital. No one found Queen Elena. She had vanished, as though the moon goddess herself had hidden her from the world. Kaelin refused to believe it. Search the southern forests. Nothing. The eastern ports. Nothing. The mountain passes. Nothing. Every report ended with the same painful sentence: no trace of Her Majesty was found. Weeks turned into months. The palace grew quieter. Elena's favorite chair remained untouched in the royal library. The greenhouse she had filled with healing herbs slowly withered without her care. Even the palace servants spoke more softly, as if afraid loud voices would make her absence more real. One rainy afternoon, the elderly royal archivist requested an audience. He carried a worn leather journal wrapped in faded blue cloth. "I believe," he said gently, "that His late Majesty intended for you to read this only when you were ready." Kaelin frowned. "My father's journal?" The old man nodded. "He instructed me to keep it sealed until I believed you had begun asking the right questions." Kaelin accepted the journal with careful hands. He spent the evening alone in his private study. The first pages described battles he already knew: treaties, harvests, diplomatic meetings. Then, halfway through the journal, he found a passage written in a noticeably shakier hand. If you are reading this, my son, then I have already left this world. Kalen's chest tightened. He continued, there is something I never had the courage to explain. I loved your mother more deeply than words could ever describe. A long silence settled over the room. Kalen kept reading. Our enemies discovered that love. They kidnapped her. When they demanded military secrets in exchange for her life, I surrendered them. His hands began to tremble. Thousands of wolves died because I placed one life above my duty. Kalen closed his eyes. This was the story whispered by historians, but never with this truth. His father had not acted out of weakness. He had acted out of desperate love. The next page contained the promise that had shaped Kalen's entire life. I made you swear never to let love destroy this kingdom. Kalen whispered the words aloud. I remember. He had repeated that oath beside his father's deathbed. He had built his entire reign around it. Then he reached the final paragraph. If you believe this means you must never love, then I have failed you twice. Kalen's breathing stopped. Love was never my mistake. Abandoning my responsibility was. Do not confuse those two things. A tear slipped onto the page before Kalen realized it had fallen. For years, he had believed emotional distance made him strong. He had honored his father's words so completely that he had twisted their meaning. His father had never asked him to deny his heart. He had only asked him not to sacrifice innocent lives because of it. Kalen looked toward the empty chair where Elena always sat during quiet evenings. He remembered every gentle smile, every thoughtful gesture, every moment she had reached toward him while he carefully kept his distance. He had believed he was protecting the kingdom. Instead, he had broken the heart of the one woman who had never asked him to choose between duty and devotion. For the first time since Elena disappeared, Kalen asked himself a question he had spent 3 years refusing to face. What if keeping his promise had become the greatest betrayal of all? Nearly a year passed. Winter gave way to spring. Spring surrendered to summer. In the capital, Queen Elena Ravenshaid became a memory wrapped in unanswered questions. But hundreds of miles away, in a quiet mountain village called Ashbrook, no one knew her as a queen. They simply called her Elena. The village had suffered through years of war. Many homes still bore the scars of fire. The nearest healer lived 2 days away. The tiny schoolhouse had collapsed during a harsh winter. Hope had become as scarce as medicine. Elena arrived carrying nothing more than the small satchel she had taken from the palace. She never spoke of where she had come from, only of what she could do. She cleaned wounds, mixed healing herbs, sat beside frightened children through sleepless nights. She taught them to read beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree when the weather was kind. When snow fell, lessons moved into the old chapel with its cracked stone walls. Soon, the villagers began relying on her for more than medicine. Widows came to her after difficult days. Young couples sought her advice before marrying. Farmers asked her to settle small disagreements before they grew into lasting feuds. Elena never claimed to know every answer. She simply listened. Sometimes, that was enough. One afternoon, a little boy named Owen arrived with a broken wooden toy. I can't fix it, he whispered. Elena smiled. Let's see. Together, they glued the tiny wagon back together. When it was finished, Owen grinned. You always make broken things better. Elena looked at the repaired toy for a long moment. Not always, but I always believe they're worth trying. The words lingered in her own heart, long after Owen ran outside to play. One evening, the villagers gathered for a simple harvest meal. An elderly woman looked across the table. Elena, she asked gently, forgive an old woman's curiosity. Were you ever married? The room grew quiet. Elena looked into her cup of warm tea. I was. Then, where is your husband? She smiled softly. Living the life he chose. No bitterness touched her voice. Only acceptance. The woman hesitated. Will you ever marry again? Elena gazed through the open window toward the mountains, glowing beneath the setting sun. After a long silence, she answered, "I've already learned something important." "What is it?" another villager asked. She folded her hands in her lap. "Being loved halfway is lonelier than being alone." No one spoke, not because they pitied her, because they understood. The conversation quietly moved on. Later that night, Elena stood beneath the ancient oak, where she taught the children each morning. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. For the first time in many years, she realized she had gone an entire day without thinking about whether Kaelin loved her. The ache was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She smiled as laughter drifted from the nearby cottages. She had spent 3 years waiting for someone else to choose her. Now she understood something far more important. Peace did not begin when another person loved you. It began when you believed your own heart was worthy of love. The woman who had once measured her happiness by the affection she hoped to receive finally chose herself, and in doing so, she quietly became the heartbeat of an entire village. While Elena found peace in the mountains, the capital slowly began to unravel. At first, the changes were almost invisible. A disagreement between 2 noble families lasted longer than it should have. A shipment of winter grain arrived a week late. An orphanage requested funding that never came. Each problem seemed small on its own. Together, they formed cracks no one had noticed before. For years, everyone had assumed King Kaelin held the kingdom together through discipline and military strength. They had overlooked the quieter force working beside him, Queen Elena. She had never sought recognition. She had simply solved problems before they became crises. When 2 noble houses argued over land, Elena invited both families to dinner. By the end of the evening, they usually left as allies instead of enemies. When harsh winters threatened remote villages, she quietly redirected palace stores before shortages became famine. She visited orphanages without announcing her arrival. She remembered children's birthdays. She ensured widows of fallen soldiers received food, blankets, and enough coin to live with dignity. No royal decree had ordered those things. She had simply believed they were the right thing to do. Without her, no one realized how many threads she had been holding together. Captain Rowan entered the throne room one cold morning carrying a stack of reports. Another dispute between the eastern clans. Kaelin accepted the papers. It has become violent. Before Elena left, she would have already spoken with both families. She somehow always knew who was hurting, long before they admitted it. Later that afternoon, the royal treasurer arrived. The northern orphanages are requesting emergency funds. Kaelin frowned. Weren't those accounts already approved? They were. The approvals were always signed by Queen Elena. Silence filled the room. Another counselor stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the winter reserve inventory is incomplete." Kaelin immediately knew why. Every autumn, Elena personally inspected every warehouse. She insisted on counting the supplies herself. No one had understood why. Now shortages were appearing across the countryside. That evening, Kaelin walked alone through the palace gardens. The roses Elena had planted were blooming despite the cold. He remembered teasing her once for spending hours tending flowers herself. She had only smiled. A garden survives because someone notices the weeds before they take over. At the time, he thought she was speaking about flowers. Now he understood she had been describing the kingdom. The next morning, Kaelin disguised himself in a simple traveling cloak and walked through the city without announcing his presence. He listened, not as a king, as a man. At the marketplace, 2 elderly women spoke while buying bread. "I miss the queen," one said quietly. "So do I. She always stopped to ask about my grandson." Another merchant nodded. "The king protects us, but the queen made us feel seen." Kaelin stood frozen. No one noticed him. For years, he had believed the kingdom's greatest shield was his army. Standing among ordinary people, he finally understood how wrong he had been. Armies defended borders. Elena had defended hearts. When he returned to the palace, he entered the empty sitting room that had once belonged to her. Her favorite chair still faced the window. A book she had been reading remained on the table, exactly where she had left it. He rested one hand on its worn cover. At last, he allowed himself to speak the truth aloud. "I never understood how much you carried." His voice broke. "And I never thanked you for it." In that quiet room, surrounded by the traces of the woman he had taken for granted, King Kaelin finally accepted the hardest truth of all. The strongest foundation of his kingdom had never been the crown upon his head. It had been the Luna standing beside him. Nearly 2 years after Elena disappeared, a traveler climbed the winding mountain road to Ashbrook. He wore no royal robes, no jeweled cloak, no golden crest marked his tunic. A simple travel pack rested across his shoulders. Tucked carefully inside was a small velvet pouch. Within it lay a plain gold wedding ring, the same ring Elena had left beside her farewell letter. Kaelin had carried it every day since. The villagers barely glanced at the stranger. Travelers occasionally passed through the mountains. He was simply another one. Following the directions of a shepherd, Kaelin continued until he reached the ancient oak tree, standing at the edge of the village. Children sat in a wide circle beneath its branches. At the center stood Elena. She held an old storybook in her hands. The children listened with wide, eager eyes. "And that," she finished with a smile, "is why courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing kindness, even when you're afraid." The children applauded. One little girl noticed Kaelin first. "Miss Elena," she whispered. "Someone's here." Elena looked up. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across her face. Then it disappeared, replaced by quiet calm. She dismissed the children with gentle smiles. "I'll see everyone tomorrow morning." When the last child ran off, silence settled beneath the oak. Kaelin stood several steps away. "I found you." Elena nodded. "I know. You've been standing there for 10 minutes. A faint smile touched his lips. "I wasn't sure if I deserved to interrupt." "You probably didn't." Her answer held no anger, only honesty. She gestured toward a nearby wooden bench. "Would you like some tea?" He blinked. "You'd offer me tea?" "I've learned difficult conversations go better with warm tea." A few minutes later, they sat together outside the small cottage where Elena now lived. Steam rose from 2 simple cups. Birdsong filled the afternoon air. Neither rushed to speak. Finally, Kaelin broke the silence. "I spent years believing that refusing to love you made me stronger." He stared into his tea. "I thought distance was discipline. I thought it honored my father's memory." He looked at her. "It didn't. It only made me a coward." Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she spoke softly. "I never wanted you to choose between me and the kingdom. I know. I only wanted the chance to decide what our marriage meant together." She folded her hands around her cup. "You decided for both of us. You chose duty. You chose distance. You never asked whether I would have accepted the risks of loving a king." Kaelin lowered his head. "I was wrong." "Yes." The word was gentle, but it landed with more force than any accusation. A long silence followed. At last, Kaelin reached into his travel pack. He placed the velvet pouch on the table. Inside rested her wedding ring. "I've carried it every day." Elena looked at it, but made no move to pick it up. "I came here hoping you'd return with me." She slowly shook her head. "No." The single word was neither cruel nor hesitant. Kaelin closed his eyes briefly. "I understand." She met his gaze. "Love deserves more than regret. It deserves change." She pushed the pouch gently back toward him. "If I ever come home, it won't be because you found me. It will be because you've become someone who no longer fears loving honestly." Kaelin nodded. There was no argument left to make, only work left to do. He stood. For the first time since they had married, he bowed to her, not as a king. As a man asking forgiveness he had not yet earned. Then he turned and quietly began the long journey back to the capital. Kaelin returned to the capital alone. The journey felt longer than the one that had taken him to Ashbrook, because this time he carried no hope of bringing Elena home. Only the truth she had given him. Love deserved more than regret. It deserved change. Those words became the beginning of everything. The very next morning, Kaelin summoned the royal council. The nobles expected another military discussion. Instead, the king placed a single document on the council table. Effective immediately, he announced. All political marriages arranged without the willing consent of both people are abolished. The chamber erupted. Your Majesty, those marriages preserve alliances. They preserve resentment, Kaelin replied. They produce duty without trust. And I will not ask another generation to live the life I forced upon my own queen. The law passed. It became the first reform in the kingdom's history to require mutual consent before any royal or noble marriage. Weeks later came another decree. The Luna would no longer serve only as the king's ceremonial partner. A permanent Luna's council was established, giving every future queen equal authority over education, public welfare, orphanages, and community affairs. Many nobles objected. Kaelin answered simply, I ignored wisdom, because it arrived with kindness instead of commands. I will never make that mistake again. The reforms continued. Future heirs to the throne would undergo public questioning before their coronation. Citizens could openly challenge their judgment, policies, and character. No ruler, Kaelin declared, should inherit unquestioned trust. A full year passed. The kingdom slowly changed. The people noticed something different about their king. He listened more. He visited villages without ceremony. He spoke with soldiers, widows, and farmers. He reopened schools Elena had once quietly supported. He restored orphanages that had struggled after her departure. Every decision carried the same purpose. Not to impress Elena, to become the man he should have been long before he met her. When another spring arrived, Kaelin packed a single travel bag. Once again, he journeyed to Ashbrook. No guards accompanied him, no royal banners announced his arrival. Only the small velvet pouch remained in his hands. Elena was tending a garden outside the village school when she saw him. This time, she smiled. A small one, but real. You came back. I said I would. He stopped a few steps away. I haven't come to ask for forgiveness. You don't owe me that. I've only come to tell you something. He opened the velvet pouch and held out the wedding ring. I once swore I'd never love my Luna. His voice trembled. It was the worst promise I ever made. He looked into her eyes. So today, I choose to break it. Silence settled between them. The mountain breeze stirred the flowers around their feet. Elena stepped closer. She took the ring from his open hand. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. Then, without waiting for him to do it, she slipped it onto her own finger. Tears filled Kaelin's eyes. She smiled softly. I don't need the king. I only ever wanted the man. He laughed through those tears. This time, you have both. He offered his hand, not as a command, not as an expectation, only an invitation. Elena looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her hand in his. Together, they started walking toward the road home. Not because destiny demanded it, not because a crown required it, but because they had finally become two people capable of choosing each other freely. 5 years after Elena returned to the capital, the kingdom had become stronger than it had ever been. Not because its armies had grown larger, not because its walls had become higher, but because its rulers had learned to lead together. The Luna's Council, once dismissed as an unnecessary experiment, had become one of the kingdom's most respected institutions. Every province elected representatives to bring the concerns of ordinary citizens directly to the palace. Teachers, healers, Veterans, craftsmen, mothers, young apprentices. For the first time, the voices shaping the kingdom reflected the people who lived in it. Political marriages became a story from history books. Young alphas and lunas were free to marry by choice, not by obligation. Families still formed alliances, but never at the cost of someone's happiness. One spring morning, Kaylin and Elena attended the graduation of the first class trained at the Royal Academy of Leadership. The students had studied military strategy, law, agriculture, diplomacy, but they had also studied compassion. Each graduate spent months working in orphanages, hospitals, and farming villages before receiving a position of authority. A young alpha asked Kaylin during the ceremony, "Your Majesty, what is the most important quality in a ruler?" Years earlier, Kaylin would have answered without hesitation, "Strength." Now he smiled. The ability to listen. He glanced toward Elena. Power tells people what to do. Wisdom begins by asking what they need. The students applauded. Later that afternoon, Elena walked through the palace gardens with several young lunas preparing for future leadership. One asked quietly, "Your Majesty, how did you learn to forgive?" Elena paused beside a blooming rosebush. "I didn't forgive all at once. I forgave one honest change at a time." She smiled gently. People deserve second chances, but trust grows only when actions keep their promises. Her words spread throughout the kingdom. Soon they were taught alongside history and law. The people noticed something else as the years passed. Kaylin never made an important decision without first seeking Elena's thoughts, not because tradition required it, because he genuinely valued her judgment. During public gatherings, he introduced her not as his queen, but as his partner. The title meant more to Elena than any jeweled crown ever could. One evening, after a long council meeting, they stood together on the same moonlit balcony where everything had once fallen apart. The memory of that painful night had never completely disappeared, but it no longer carried sorrow, only gratitude for how far they had come. Kaylin gently took Elena's hand. "I used to believe love weakened rulers," she smiled. "And now, I think love is what reminds them who they're ruling for." Elena rested her head against his shoulder. Below them, the capital glowed with peaceful streets, lively markets, and families who no longer feared that duty and compassion stood on opposite sides. The kingdom flourished because its king and queen had finally discovered the truth that had eluded them for so many years. The greatest leaders were not those who ruled alone. They were those humble enough to walk beside one another. Many years passed. King Kaylin's dark hair had turned silver. Queen Elena's gentle smile carried the quiet confidence that only time could give. The kingdom they had rebuilt together knew a generation that had never experienced war, forced political marriages, or a palace divided by silence. On the morning of the spring moon ceremony, thousands gathered before the moon altar. A young alpha prince was preparing to swear the oath before becoming the kingdom's next ruler. Unlike the kings before him, he would not promise only strength, he would promise wisdom. The high priest raised an ancient scroll. "This oath," he announced, "was written by Queen Elena Ravenshade." The prince stepped forward. His voice rang clearly across the courtyard. "Duty without love becomes cruelty." He paused. "Love without duty becomes selfishness." The crowd remained silent. Then he spoke the final line. "A true ruler must carry both." The words echoed against the palace walls. Beside the altar stood another stone tablet. Its inscription had been added years later by King Kaylin. The prince turned and read it aloud. "Never confuse guarding your heart with closing it." Kaylin lowered his eyes. Those words had cost him almost everything before he finally understood them. Elena reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined with the ease of two people who no longer needed to wonder where they stood in each other's hearts. After the ceremony, the young prince approached them. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing respectfully. "Thank you." Kaelin smiled. "For what?" "For teaching us that a ruler can be both strong and kind." Elena answered before Kaelin could. "Never stop learning. The moment you believe you've mastered leadership is the moment you begin failing the people who trust you." The prince nodded thoughtfully. "I'll remember." As evening settled over the capital, Kaelin and Elena walked through the palace gardens. They stopped beneath the old willow tree, where Elena often read to orphaned children years earlier. The tree had grown tall. Its branches stretched wide enough to shade an entire family. Kaelin looked toward the setting sun. "Do you ever think about that night?" Elena smiled softly. "The banquet?" He nodded. "I wish I could erase every word." She squeezed his hand. "I don't." He looked at her in surprise. "If you had never spoken those words, neither of us would have become who we needed to be." He let out a quiet laugh. "You always find hope where I expect regret." She rested her head against his shoulder. "That's because hope builds better futures." They stood together as the first stars appeared above the kingdom they had shaped side by side. History never forgot the night an Alpha King declared he would never love his Luna. But history remembered something greater. It remembered the dawn that followed. The queen disappeared without a trace. The king searched until he found not only the woman he had lost, but the man he needed to become. And every future ruler who stood before the moon altar carried their story forward. Not as a tale of regret, but as proof that the strongest promise a person can make is the courage to break the one that keeps them from becoming better.